Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We are super excited to share this work with you today. My name is Anjali Adukia, and I am presenting joint work with Alex Ebley, a faculty member at Teachers College Columbia University, Emily Harrison, a PhD student at the Harris School of Public Policy here at the University of Chicago, and Hakizumwami Barali Runesha and Theodora Sass, who are at the University of Chicago Research Computing Center, who have really led our computational social science aspects of this. And we're going to be talking about representation in children's books. So the process of education itself and its associated books and curricular materials necessarily and by design transmits not only the values of society, but also whose space it is. Right? And the inclusion and exclusion of different identities sends messages which can contribute to how children view their own potential and the potential of others. And these messages, whether they're implicit or explicit, contribute to how children not only, view the potential of themselves and others, but they can also form subconscious defaults based on the presence and absence of identities, such as gender and race, and other identities. And it's really important that gender and race are not treated as these mutually exclusive categories of experience and analysis. And, it's very important within any analysis to account for how these identities can intersect with experiences of exclusion and subordination. So for example, if you're looking at experiences of women, you don't just focus on white women. And if you're focusing on experiences of people of color, you're not just focusing on males of color. So there is this notion that representation matters, and there have been these calls for increased representation over time. And what we don't really know is, has this actually happened? But an important part of that is to understand how to systematically measure representation. In traditional content analysis, people literally would go page by page and get very deep knowledge, and understanding about the characters in a book. But this is extremely expensive to do, both in terms of time and other resources. And so therefore, necessarily these analyses are often limited to small samples. And so what we are wanting to do is actually really harness the power of artificial intelligence to be able to look at estimates over, a very large set of corpora, where you can look at millions of pages as opposed to dozens. Now, of course, it's not perfect, AI, because it is trained by humans, it reflects all of the biases of human coders themselves, but this is the same problem that comes out of traditional content analysis as well. So in this study, what we're looking at is we're focused on award-winning books. We think about school libraries as major purveyors of children's content that's, sends a signal that this is sanctioned. This is, these are the kinds of materials that we want children to be reading. And so we're going to be looking at like Newbery books, Caldecott books, Coretta Scott King Award winners. And, there's two parts to this. First, we're going to be thinking about like, how do we measure representation systematically? And in particular, we're going to be developing tools to convert images into data. There's the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And yet in most analyses, especially in quantitative analyses, images are not actually taken into account. And then we'll also be drawing upon established text analysis tools. We'll be asking who is represented. And there's three main identities we're going to be looking at. One is gender identity. And it's very important to recognize that, we are going to be focusing on the binarization of gender. And, future work really should be accounting for the inclusion of non-binary or genderqueer or gender fluid identities. We'll look at race, and race itself is an amorphous, ill-defined construct. And so we're going to look at it in terms of three measures. One, the skin color of characters who are pictured in images. We'll also be looking at putative race. So, as society might name race, so whether someone's Black or white or Asian, and people's place of origin. And then we'll also be looking at whether someone is a child or an adult. And then we'll also look at who is doing the representing and to see whether different book collections represent people differently. And, why are we looking at award-winning children's books? It's because they're highly influential. They're very likely to show up, in school libraries and classrooms, on people's bookshelves. And to give you a sense of how we're actually breaking these up. So this set of awards are all given by the American Library Association, and we break them up into mainstream collections. So think about like the Newbery and Caldecotts, which go back to 1922 or the 1930s, and they're meant to highlight books that are of high literary value, but there's no explicit intention to highlight specific identities. But then there's this whole other set of books, such as the Coretta Scott King Awards, that are literally meant to, or that have been established to recognize specific identities. Up until 1970, there had been no authors of color who had received the Newbery or Caldecott. And so the Coretta Scott King Awards were established to highlight the African-American experience. And then, other awards followed to highlight other identities. And then we break them up further into smaller collections, that highlight people of color, people with different abilities, females, and LGBTQ individuals. And just to give you a brief overview about our methods, so in order to turn images into data, we have a model that takes the page and detects the face within a page. Then to characterize the skin color, we isolate the region of interest. In this case, it's the facial region. And what's important to recognize is that it's not that we can then just say, okay, what's the skin color, because there might be shadowing or highlighting, and there's a multitude of different colors within one particular face. So then we take the most predominant skin colors, and then we create a weighted average of those skin colors. And we can either measure it continuously in terms of skin tint, or we can actually trichotomize the this particular distribution and think about those characters who might have darker skin colors, medium skin colors, or lighter skin colors. And then there's actually a set of other features that we can identify through other models, where we can identify or predict the race, the age, and the gender of this particular image. And we get a predicted probability, and then we can assign these particular features. And then this gives us, in the end, a skin color measure, a gender measure, an age measure, and a race measure for the images. We also draw upon established text tools from which we get basic word counts. So words related to gender, such as pronouns or queen, boy, etc. We can get words related to colors, such as black, white, blue, is like very rudimentary measures. But we also can pull from character names, and so there are famous characters such as Rosa Parks, where we can get their gender, their birthplace, and their putative race. And then we can also take first names, that might appear, as characters, and then predict their gender based off of Social Security Administration data. And then that gives us a set of measures where we can actually, look at race, gender, and age over time. And so, what I'm going to first show you here is the distribution of skin colors that are actually represented in these collections. And remember that mainstream, which we will always depict as pink, books are the Newbery and Caldecott book corpora, and the diversity collection is comprised of all of the others, and that will also always be depicted as blue. And so, the way to read this is, on the left-hand side means that darker skin colors are represented, and on the right-hand side, it means lighter skin colors are represented. And what you can see is that, the mainstream collection generally represents lighter skin colors relative to the diversity collection. And when you look at this on average, when you, break it up by those three bins, you see that actually what's interesting is that the mainstream collection, it's, almost like it's representing this racial ambiguation of, it's neither, very, very dark skin colors or very, very light skin colors, but more in the middle. And, some people might call this like a butterscotching effect. Whereas the diversity collection is much more likely to represent, darker skin tones and medium skin tones. And, when we look at this by collection, we see that this, pattern holds for collections that highlight people of color, and also the collection that highlights females. And, when we look at this over time, one thing you can actually see in the mainstream that there is this, butterscotching throughout. And what you might expect is actually, there's going to be an increase in darker skin colors represented. But actually, over the last 3 decades, there's actually also this increase in lighter skin that's being represented. Whereas for diversity, it does seem like there's, a consistent representation of darker and medium skin colors. Now, and there's three different kinds of skin colors. There are, character colors that you might see. There's the, human skin colors where R is greater than G is greater than B. But there's also monochromatic, so the black and white or the sepia tone. And then there's, non-typical colors such as, the blue alien or the green robot. And regardless of which way you look at it, the patterns remain the same. Now, we noted that there's this uptick over time, especially in the mainstream collection of representing characters as lighter. And actually, when you look at the skin color classification by the race predictions, you actually see that the mainstream collection depicts, people of a given race with lighter skin than people of the same race in the diversity collection. So for example, the way to read this is, you can see that, when the mainstream collection depicts people who are Asian, they depict them with lighter skin than when the diversity collection depicts people who are Asian. And this is the case for, each race category. And we see that, people who are white are predominantly identified in images, regardless of the collection. And when you dig deeper into this, you see that, females or faces that are identified as being female are substantially present over time, still on average for most collections, less than 50%, but still, more than one might expect, especially going back in time. But then, when you see who are these people, they are predominantly, white women and of course, white men. And this pattern is actually repeated when you look at the race and gender classifications of famous people. So again, think about Rosa Parks, George Washington, where, it is predominantly white men who are represented, followed by either white women or Black men, depending on the collection. And, generally, regardless, within collections, males or within races, males are generally more represented than females. When you want to even just look at like the top 10 appearances of famous figures over time, this is just looking at the mainstream and the diversity collections, the top 10 male or the top 10 characters or famous figures in the mainstream collection are all white males. And in the diversity collection, they're all males, except for Rosa Parks, who's the only female who's represented in the top 10. Now, when you want to just think about like, well, how does this relate to the US population share? And to be very clear, we are saying nothing in this about like what optimal representation should look like. But some people might say, well, how does this track the US population share over time? And so the orange line here represents the population share of the given race that's indicated in the column header. And what you see is that for the US population of Black people, the US population share of Black people is much greater than the share of Black famous figures mentioned in the text of mainstream books. Whereas you see the opposite for famous people who are white, where you see that famous people who are white are overrepresented relative to the US population share of white people. You see this increase in the population of people who are Latinx over time without a corresponding increase in famous Latinx people represented in the mainstream collection. Now, you can also think about looking at race or the construct of race in terms of birthplace. And so in the mainstream collection, you see that people are generally come from, the US or Europe, whereas in the diversity collection, there's much more geographic heterogeneity from around the world. But once again, when you look at like who is coming from these other places, they are predominantly males who are being drawn from, places outside of the US or Europe. A little bit in the diversity collection, you'll see females, but much more you'll see males. Now, if you just look at gender and you think about the distribution of all female words across collections, so when we say all female words, we're talking about pronouns, gendered words such as like queen and boy. We're talking about the gender of, the characters and the famous figures. And you see that the mainstream collection is much more female skewed than the diversity collection. And when you look at it across collections, of particular note is, so this is the collection that's meant to highlight females. You see that while it is more skewed female, it is much less skewed female than mainstream collection is skewed male. And, again, if you think about the population share of females over time, what's interesting is that for every single collection, except for the female collection, they are all on average, less than half, and never actually reach the US population share. And it doesn't matter how you look at this, right? So, one might say, well, pronouns, when I was growing up, the he was the gender neutral term. So if that were the case, then you should actually see, sure, like maybe, there'd be a higher male share of words from pronouns, but then it shouldn't matter in terms of whether you're saying queen or boy, or if you're using, a name like Jennifer or Jyoti, or, the famous figures that you're drawing from. And it doesn't matter, all of them are less than 50% except for the female collection. Except what's interesting is when you look at the share of unique famous figures who are females, you see that even the female collection is less than a third unique famous figures. So for example, if Rosa Parks is mentioned 3 times within a book, she gets a value of 1. So that means that 69% of the famous figures that are mentioned in the female collection are actually men. We also see that females are more likely to be represented in images rather than text over time, which is consistent with the maxim that women should be seen but not heard. And this just suggests that there may be symbolic inclusion in pictures without substantive inclusion in the actual story. We also see, despite that, these are books that are centered, they're supposed to be focused on children, regardless whether you look in the images or the text, you see that more adults are represented than children. And then when you dig deeper and actually say, well, how are children represented differently than adults? So just to kind of explain this, like light blue gray actually represents adults, and the purple on the right represents children. You see that for every single collection, children are actually depicted as lighter than the adults are, which again can have potentially, quite pernicious, implications. And, that's just conjecture, and future work needs to be done. So in summary, we see that images are a very powerful but underused data source. And, these machine learning tools can present a very cost-effective option for, large-scale content analysis, and, especially for, publishers or content developers to decide, okay, well, what do we want to be putting in front of children? And what we see is that, the diversity collection is much more likely to show, darker skin. The mainstream collection, depicts people as having lighter skin than people of the same race in the diversity collection, and that, in general, they are more likely to, show more chromatically ambiguous characters with this recent increase in lighter skin. Children are more likely to be depicted with lighter skin than adults. And regardless, males, especially white males, are much more likely to be represented no matter the data source, whether it's gendered words such as pronouns, character names, famous figures, geographic heterogeneity in images. And then we see that, females are much more likely to be, represented in images than text over time, and, suggesting that there might be this symbolic inclusion in pictures without substantive inclusion in the actual story. So I will stop there, and yeah, we welcome any questions. Yeah, so actually something that we really want to do, and we don't think of this as just an academic exercise, right? That we would love to make our pipelines, both for processing text and images, available to anybody to use, and publishers in particular. I mean, a big bottleneck on our side is to actually be able to digitize all of these books, both the image and text, and then process them, whereas publishers have the raw data. And so they can literally just take their text and feed it through the pipeline. And, ideally it'll actually spit out, these figures themselves. And similarly, with the images, if it can go through the pipeline, then they can actually have a sense of, okay, well, how representative is, a given book or, a particular set of materials. And, again, it is their decision as to, like, what their optimal set of representation is. And you can imagine that they might want to act as social architects, right? Where it's like, okay, no one book or piece of curricular materials can, take account of everything. Otherwise, you really could, lead to tokenism, right? But, instead, it can actually think about like, well, what could the overall curriculum, depict, and what representation do we want to be showing overall?
If I could add something briefly to that, one of the big things that we find is that even deliberate efforts to increase representation on certain dimensions often don't account for intersectional identity. So one of the things that we see is that in these books, which are specifically chosen to highlight given identities, often women of the given identity are less well represented than men. And so we think that one immediate use of our tools would be to avoid that kind of mistake in future efforts.
So, as we see in those mainstream awards, that actually it's, so I can share my screen again. So, even over the last, 10 years, we actually see almost like a decrease in like the female presenting cases, or if you wanted to look at, over here. So, you see in the mainstream collection over the last 3 decades, actually, so if this is 1990, there's been this uptick in like lighter skin colors, which could be actually an increase in, okay, so they say that they have someone who's Black, or they say they have someone who's Asian, but they're depicting them with lighter skin. In terms of covers, it's something that we've talked about doing it, we certainly can do. We haven't yet like isolated just the cover itself, but we certainly can.
So first of all, we have tried to use some existing methods that are state-of-the-art in detecting faces in photos and in images in general. And what we observed is that the AI and these convolutional neural networks are mainly trained on photos of humans. So we were trying those tools on our images in textbooks, and we've seen that majority of time we were unable to detect these faces. So we had to go ahead and look at state-of-the-art tools like there is this so-called AutoML, which is an automatic way of doing machine learning that takes care of optimization, and train our models with several images of faces of illustrations to be able then to go ahead and predict faces in illustrations. And we actually realized that we were able, after training these models, to detect 3 times more faces that we usually have detected using Google Vision, an API that Google made for training models to detect their faces or the faces that they need.
And Barali, she had mentioned earlier about like how these are going to be made available. Do you want to talk about the software suite a little bit more?
Yeah, if I can comment on that. The team actually, while we are undergoing this academic exercising and coming up with model that we believe will provide better results, ultimately what we're trying to develop at the end is how do we package this pipeline? How do we package all these tools so that an end user, a lay person, can download it and be able to use on a new corpora, being able to use without even having to understand all the complexity behind it, and be also able to use it in the convenience of their own platform. So there is the goal really is coming up with what we believe will be the methodology that will help us achieve this representation and be able to measure it, and also to produce tools and pipeline that can be used by the broader audience. And there's a lot of effort and different teams on working on different parts of it, and trying to also making sure that we are following best practices of software development, and something that the industry can easily adopt.
Yeah, one of the things that we are pushing nowadays is really think about the input to be able to get images, text of all kind, not only textbooks, even videos sometimes, and be able to process those in a very efficient way and at a very efficient speed as well.
Yeah. And on that front also, when we say pipeline, there's actually in some cases a lot of computational bottleneck and different hardware that in some cases you really need to be an expert to even understand on how to run on those hardware. And the goal for us is, how do you abstract that? Even I could say, I'm going to go on the cloud, for example, can I just write it, just pay the money to write it without having to build the machine myself, and then just containerize it and just move it as a whole working tool. The other thing I also wanted to comment on what Dora indicated, to just kind of emphasize, a lot of the tool you see that are trained on images are really trained on proper, like on photos. And what you find in children books are really sometimes illustrations. And then there's not as many trained model on things like that. I think for me, that was one of the differentiator, because the team had to pretty much train their own data set, basically. And that's how they were able to achieve those results, and 3 times better than what, for example, you can use just straight from Google Vision API.
And just one thing I wanted to add in terms of, the question about publishers and, how this can actually be useful for them. And so it is interesting how we, definitely came at this with this notion of, from a social science perspective, but actually, there is using these tools is actually very cost effective. Emily, do you want to talk about this?
Before we were able to collaborate with the RCC and the computer scientists there, we had started by hand coding a set of books. And it took so long to go through like all of the text and all of the images. So there are pros and cons. Like when we went through it by hand, we were able to identify like, this is the main character, this is the protagonist. And so those are the kinds of things that we can't get out of the pipeline that we're currently using. But we can look at so many more books, like just an infinite number more. As long as we can have it digitized, we can run it through. So there's a lot of pros and cons to both, but this is definitely very a cost-effective way to look at a large corpus. And we actually recently were talking to a librarian where they were interested in looking at their entire library collection, and that's just not something that would be possible with manual coding.
And actually, like when you look at the hand coders, how good of a job they did in terms of like the manual coding as opposed to what our AI tools, you actually see very similar patterns, so this is like, in the images versus the text, you see that, our hand coders, were more likely to find, males detected, or males in the images, or males mentioned in the text, relative to females. And, there's a similar pattern within our AI tool. And interestingly, even for skin color, like as we mentioned, that kind of butterscotching or the racial ambiguation, originally we were thinking about using like an emoji type scale for the skin color, bins. Like right now we're looking at darker, medium, or lighter skin tones. And this is just breaking it up into 6. And you do see this kind of bump in terms of, it is skewed lighter skin colors, but, it does seem like it kind of humps up and then goes down.
Yeah, so we've thought a lot about this, and we think that there are 3 sort of really clear uses for this that we hope are going to have a big lever on sort of changing the way that society deals with this. The most obvious use is for people who use books. That can be parents, that can be teachers, librarians, it can be principals, but it's a tool that we hope to make immediately implementable with the sort of right amount of funding and sort of build up, so that people can use this to choose between the incredible menu of books. If their goal is to include, say, at least, half women as protagonists or as, main characters or as frequently featured characters in their books, they can use our tool to say, okay, does this book have the right proportion of men to women, or the right proportion of lighter skinned and darker skinned characters pictured? And that could be parents, librarians, teachers, principals. The second sort of place where it could be used is in policy. If you were a policymaker and you wanted to ensure that children were shown a version of the world where people who look like them and people who don't look like them are sort of equitably inhabiting the world, this can guide policy. And we think there's an important tension between images and text, and we think that we really push out on that. The third thing, which perhaps, I'm trained as an economist and I'm very much a nerdy academic. And so this, to me, is like the most transformational side of this, is that we think that these tools will really instigate a dramatic sort of flourishing of new lines of inquiry across a wide range of social sciences, from economics and sociology to political science, to marketing, to anthropology. We are constantly bombarded with media, text and images on the subway, in our books, on our phones, and we think that these tools can be used to dramatically increase our understanding of what messages we're pulling out of that contact with media. It would be able to make recommendations, but I think at the moment, this is very much a positivist approach. We are describing the world, and the sort of normative approach of recommendations for increasing diversity and so forth would sort of necessarily have to come from policy and from the people who are deciding this content. And so I think a separate line of inquiry is what ought to be. But as Anjali said, that's really a separate set of papers. And what we're hoping to do is to empower people, and again, parents, librarians, policymakers, scholars, to better make those kind of decisions.
Yeah, I mean, this notion of what is, optimal representation, in some ways, like, it's going to vary on setting and, each stakeholder's, vision and needs. And so, that's why we're not kind of saying anything about that at this point. I mean, some people might say, well, it should match the population, but which population? The population in the US, in your state, in your city, in your country, around the world? Should it be everybody is equally represented? And so we're not saying anything about that, but the nice thing is that we would at least have the measurement, right? At the very least, we can measure this, to some degree, and then people can actually use that information to decide, okay, do I want to increase representation in, from this angle or that angle? And, it'll at least give the user those tools to be able to make such decisions.
So in addition to sort of the measurement thing that we do, which we think, again, we kind of got on our soapbox and talked about all the ways these tools could be used, separately, we think that what we show is for these books that are just omnipresent through children's lives. Anyone who's been to a Scholastic book fair or a Book It, if you were a kid in the 90s, saw these books and had these books pushed on them, so to speak. And we're showing, very surprisingly, that not only is there less equitable representation than we would hope for, but also the trends aren't as, towards, the arc of progress as we might have hoped. And we think that that is separately a very important result.
And actually, on that first result that Alex was just mentioning, in terms of looking at the demand for these books, so once these books are given an award, that you see these this increase in, like, book acquisition, these particular book acquisition, but substantially more so for the Newbery and Caldecott's relative to the diversity award winning books. So clearly the exposure that children are getting is much greater with those books, and so therefore the messages accordingly, they're going to be more likely to encounter a specific set of messages relative to those who are seeing the diversity collection award-winning books. And so there's this notion that diversity is not yet mainstream, clearly.
we're probably going to be releasing it in phases. I think, like in all software development, the thing that really takes a long time is the peer reviewing, the packaging, and then making sure that is robust enough and publishing. But like Angela indicated, our goal of interest is to make them available as soon as we can, and also to use the feedback from the community to improve on the quality of those tools and items that we are putting out. Another area where we think we'll see also some application being part of a university. We have a lot of students that want to also learn how to use such tools, and we see that can be also an opportunity for them to use those tools as they learn how to gain skills in this field.
One thing I want to add is we are currently working on applying some techniques of, I think you heard about responsible AI. So explainable AI, interpretable AI. For example, we want to see when the model looks at the age in an image, where exactly it looks into, and kind of build a bit more trust with our models. We are currently working on being able to trust our models enough that we can share them with other communities.
We're really excited about the potential of these tools, and we're also very surprised at a lot of these findings, and we're delighted to share this with you. Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for your questions.